Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 530, For Love of Aprons. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am wearing an apron. I know. How could you tell? But this whole lockdown thing and pockets. We've had our discussions about pockets going back to Herland, and since Herland, all of the articles online coming out about pockets in women's clothing. That all of the articles that you have sent to me, pockets are a thing. Yoga pants do not have pockets. So during this whole lockdown thing, even though the lockdown technically is over, we are still pretty much homebound in Casa de Craftlit. So, aprons. I had two. I didn't realize I had two, but I had two blue denim Tucson Handweavers Association pocketed aprons that I had started wearing pretty much all day, every day in March. And that's fine. But I was getting kind of tired of the denim, and you had to tie it, and it's kind of restrictive, and the thing around the neck was starting to meh. So I went on an apron search, and that search led me to Etsy to downloadable, piece them together, tape them together patterns. And I found a pattern for what is being referred to as a Japanese crossback apron. I found one that I liked, and I decided to get it. It was, I don't know, $4, something like that. I will link out to it in the show notes. And I did the whole thing. I used a paper cutter and sliced edges off of different pages as instructed in the pattern instructions. I believe the woman who wrote the pattern is not a native English speaker, and so some of her instructions I kind of had trouble with, but between just knowing how to sew, basically, and the pictures that she provided, I was able to piece it together and create a really quite easy to make crossback over the head, I guess, because the crossback is permanent. You sew the shoulder seams together with the back crossed, if that makes sense. I know there are apron patterns from the 30s, I think, predominantly, that have a similar pattern. And one of the reasons I believe why this particular type of pattern became such a big deal in the 30s is because it covers your entire front. So during the Depression, when you really weren't going to have new clothes that you could dive into should you do something untoward while cooking or whatevering in your regular clothes, this sucker will cover everything. And yet, because there's no tie in the back, super comfortable and easy to move around in. And because I made it myself, I could make the pockets as big and as many as I wanted to. And I'm in love. I decided I would treat my first attempt at this as kind of a demo, just to see if I could make it work. And then I would use real fabric later if I wanted to. And I had an old sheet, a burgundy sheet, which also meant that I had automatically hemmed the bottom of it, which I thought was so clever of me. And in fact, it was. I'm very happy. Actually, everyone on the Thursday night call, you got to see the shoulders of this thing without knowing it. So congratulations and welcome. Love it. Love it. I am actually going to make another version with a linen-y, a washable linen, just as seen in the photograph on the pattern itself, because It's really quite lovely. And if it were made out of a nicer fabric, I think I would wear it outside to the store and everything. I did start wearing those denim aprons out to the store because I had a debit card, a handkerchief, a mask, a pen, a pencil, a ruler, a pocket knife. I had everything with me all the time. Why would I not wear it to the store? However, depending on the store that I went to, masked up and all, there was always that risk that people were going to think that I worked at the store, which ended in some hilarity on a couple of occasions. That being said, though, I'm a huge fan. Everybody should have an apron. I'm not getting any money for doing that promo at all. I just think aprons right now, really useful. Aprons aside, however, we have 2 chapters today, and they're good. And they are leading us into some of the more complicated people moments in the text. I'm not going to re-release an updated version of the character PDF that I'd been building, which Kathy last night on the call, thank you for letting me know that was useful. She's been able to get these PDF pattern things from the Libsyn site, and they should show up attached to the episodes from the app, I believe. I need to check on that. So next week, 531, there will be an updated character chart for you. In today's final chapter, you will hear the names kind of rambled off for you, but the people won't actually show up until next week. So we have a voicemail from listener Rob, who's also a fabulous English teacher. And I think what he has to say is quite right. Here we go.
Hi, it's Bob in Maryland. I'm a little behind, but wanted to leave a comment about Chapter 20 from last week. I think you gave the uncle some short shrift. Yes, he may have been quiet compared to the aunt, but he clearly has been paying attention, because by the time she comes to uncle to ask for his permission to marry, he's already seen her interest and has already looked into his finances and gives her a warning that he has, Huntington that is, has spent quite a bit of his inheritance, which is something he's already admitted to her. So that's actually like the second time she's gotten this warning that, he's got to change his ways, otherwise they'll be destitute. But he says, he marshals his forces. He still has a tidy sum left, and they can live on it just fine. And with that in mind, he's okay with this. So he's better than you think. Been enjoying the book. Thanks for your help. Bye.
So yeah, I think you make a good case, Rob. As you were talking, I also got a sense that one of the reasons that Anne Bronte may have put the uncle in as she did was to show how benevolent, kind, good people who, as you made the case for, are paying attention and are doing due diligence, because they are good, kind, and benevolent people, might not think to wonder what this guy was doing with his money that would have blown through it so fast, or would just have, chalked it up to youthful exuberance and let it go at that, because it's very likely that that is how he might have been when he was young. Obviously not to the same extent, because he still has a fortune. This week, even more than last week, we start to see the first tentacles to slide out of the mists, showing us what the uncle missed. You're right, by just basically being a nice guy. It never should have occurred to him that Huntington could be anything other than just youthfully exuberant. This week, stuff gets serious. Not super serious, but serious enough that if warning bells aren't going through your head as you listen today, go back and listen again. Because there are several specific places where your hair on your back of your neck should get all prickly. So I'm going to read to you part of a paragraph out of the introduction to one of the copies of Wildfell Hall that I've been using for background. And I'm going to read it to you just because it is going to be more succinct than me trying to explain this. But the reason I am bringing this up is because we need to be reminded of a particular, peculiar reality of Anne Bronte's day. Here we go. Helen's diary, which is what we're in the middle of, builds a case against the marriage laws of Anne Bronte's day in the light of this disastrous acculturation of men. Several years after the publication of Wildfell Hall, the case of Mrs. Norton focused the deep injustice of the marriage laws. Her husband brought legal actions against her on the grounds of adultery with Lord Melbourne. When she was proved innocent, he still went on to deprive her of her children, refused her maintenance, and claimed what she had earned for herself by writing pamphlets, all of which he could legitimately do, since a married woman was, and this is in italics, femme couverte, having no legal existence in her own right, and hence no right to her own property, because she herself was property, save in the form of settlements of statute law. As the popular summary had it, quote, husband and wife are one person under the law, and that person is the husband. Now, we know from Jane Eyre that Rochester was prevented from getting a divorce. However, if you were a peer, if you were a lord, you would have been able to divorce your wife if you could prove adultery. So that's just something to file away in the back of your mind, that in that one instance, there was a way out of a bad marriage, but only if you were the guy or you happened to be married to someone in the peerage who was decent enough to grant a divorce if you wanted one, I guess, if you were female. One of the other interesting things that happened when this book was released, aside from the fact that Charlotte Bronte shut it down after Anne died, was that a lot of the reviews made it clear that in their day, these types of rapscallions were simply not allowed to continue that behavior. And perhaps back during the Regency period, they got away with things like this, but certainly not now. To which Anne Bronte responded, dude, I've seen it. I watched it happen in front of me. And in fact, the family that she was a governess for did eventually divorce. The couple did divorce. So she did. She saw something going on. So why do I bring this up? I bring this up because we are about to witness Helen breaking the law. Technically, as property, she cannot deny herself, and by that I mean her body, to her husband, because he owns it, her body. He owns her, herself. Helen is an interesting, if quiet, rebel and rule breaker, and it shouldn't be glossed over lightly. Just another thing to file in the back of your mind as we listen today. Couple more things just to keep in mind. There was no way to get on Anne Bronte's bad side faster than to abuse animals. That put you in the not a friend category super fast. You will hear a very coded, very quick reference to Helen that I will confirm when we get to the other side. I'm sure you will catch on quickly. You'll also hear dates fly by in today's chapters. Just kind of keep a vague track of them in your mind so you can track how long it takes for us to get from the beginning of the first chapter today all the way to the end of the second, because time moves rather rapidly. And as you'll see on the flip side, you'll want to have that noted. Alrighty, here we go with chapters 24 and 25 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, read for us by Mia Daguerre.
Chapter 24. First Quarrel. March 25th. Arthur is getting tired. Not of me, I trust, but of the idle, quiet life he leads. And no wonder, for he has so few sources of amusement. He never reads anything but newspapers or sporting magazines, and when he sees me occupied with a book, he won't let me rest till I close it. In fine weather, he generally manages to get through the time pretty well, but on rainy days, of which we've had a good many of late, it's quite painful to witness his ennui. I do all I can to amuse him, but it's impossible to get him to feel interested in what I most like to talk about, while on the other hand, he likes to talk about things that cannot interest me, or even that annoy me, and these please him the most of all, for his favourite amusement is to sit or loll beside me on the sofa and tell me stories of his former amours, always turning upon the ruin of some confiding girl or the cozening of some unsuspected husband. When I express my horror and indignation, he lays it all to the charge of jealousy, and laughs till the tears run down his cheeks. I used to fly into passions or melt into tears at first, but seeing his delight increased in proportion to my anger and agitation, I've since endeavoured to suppress my feelings and receive his revelations in the silence of calm contempt. But still he reads the inward struggle in my face and misconstrues my bitterness of soul for his unworthiness into the pangs of wounded jealousy, and when he has sufficiently diverted himself with that, or fears my displeasure will become too serious for his comfort, he tries to kiss and soothe me into smiles again. Never were his caresses so little welcome as then. This is double selfishness, displayed to me and to the victims of his former love. There are times when, with a momentary pang, a flash of wild dismay, I ask myself, Helen, what have you done? But I rebuke the inward questioner, and repel the obtrusive thought that crowd upon me. For were he 10 times as sensual and impenetrable as to good and lofty thoughts, I well know I have no right to complain. And I don't and won't complain. I do and will love him still, and I do not and will not regret that I have linked my fate with his. April 4th. We have had a downright quarrel. The particulars are as follows. Arthur had told me at different intervals the whole story of his intrigue with Lady F., which I would not believe before. It was some consolation, however, to find that in this insistence the lady had been more to blame than he, for he was very young at the time, and she had decidedly made the first advances, if what he said was true. I hated her for it seemed as if she had chiefly contributed to his corruption, and when he was beginning to talk about her the other day, I begged he would not mention her, for I detested the very sound of her name. Not because you loved her, Arthur, mind, but because she injured you and deceived her husband, and was altogether a very abominable woman, who you ought to be ashamed to mention. But he defended her by saying that she had a doting old husband who it was impossible to love. Then why did she marry him? Said I. For his money, was the reply. Then that was another crime, and her solemn promise to love and honour him was another, that only increased the enormity of the last. You are too severe upon the poor lady, laughed he. But never mind, Helen, I don't care for her now, and I never loved any of them half as much as I do you, so you needn't fear to be forsaken like them. If you had told me these things before, Arthur, I never should have given you the chance. Wouldn't you, my darling? Most certainly not. He laughed incredulously. I wish I could convince you of it now, cried I, starting up from beside him, and for the first time in my life, and I hope the last, I wished I had not married him. Helen, said he, more gravely, do you know that if I believed you now I should be very angry? But thank heaven I don't, though you stand there with your white face and flashing eyes looking at me like a very tigress. I know the heart within you, perhaps a trifle better than you know it yourself. Without another word I left the room and locked myself up in my own chamber. In about half an hour he came to the door, and first he tried the handle, and then he knocked. Won't you let me in, Helen? No, you have displeased me, I replied, and I don't want to see your face or hear your voice again till the morning. He paused for a moment, as if dumbfounded, or uncertain as how to answer such a speech, and then turned and walked away. This was only an hour after dinner. I knew he would find it very dull to sit alone all the evening, and this considerably softened my resentment, though it did not make me relent. I was determined to show him that my heart was not his slave, and I could live without him if I chose, and I sat down and wrote a long letter to my aunt, of course telling her nothing of this. Soon after 10 o'clock I heard him come up again, but he passed my door and went straight to his own dressing-room, where he shut himself in for the night. I was rather anxious to see how he would meet me in the morning, and a little disappointed to behold him enter the breakfast-room with a careless smile. "You still cross, Helen?" said he, approaching as if to salute me. I coldly turned to the table and began to pour out the coffee, observing that he was rather late. He uttered a low whistle and sauntered away to the window, where he stood for some minutes looking out upon the pleasing prospect of the sullen grey clouds, streaming rain, soaking lawn and dripping leafless trees, and muttering execrations on the weather, and then sat down to breakfast. While taking his coffee, he muttered it was damn cold. "You should not have left it so long," said I. He made no answer, and the meal was concluded in silence. It was a relief to both when the letter-bag was brought in. It contained, upon examination, a newspaper and 1 or 2 letters for him, and a couple of letters for me, which he tossed across the table without remark. One was from my brother, and the other from Millicent Hargrave, who is now in London with her mother. His, I think, were business letters, and apparently not much to his mind, for he crushed them into his pocket with some muttered expletives that I should have reproved him for at any other time. The paper he set before him, and pretended to be deeply absorbed in its contents during the remainder of breakfast and for a considerable time after. The reading and answering of my letters in the direction of household concerns afforded me ample employment for the morning. After lunch I got my drawing, and from dinner till bedtime I read. Meanwhile poor Arthur was sadly at a loss for something to amuse him or occupy his time. He wanted to appear as busy and unconcerned as I did. Had the weather at all permitted, he would doubtless have ordered his horse and set off to some distant region, no matter where, immediately after breakfast, and not return till night. Had there been a lady anywhere within reach of any age between 15 and 45, he would have sought revenge and found employment in getting up or trying to get up a desperate flirtation with her. But being, to my private satisfaction, entirely cut off from both these sources of diversion, his sufferings were truly deplorable. When he had done yawning over his paper and scribbling short answers to his shorter letters, he spent the remainder of the morning and the whole of the afternoon in fidgeting about from room to room, watching the clouds, cursing the rain, alternatively petting and teasing him and abusing his dogs, and sometimes lounging on the sofa with a book that he could not force himself to read, and very often fixedly gazing at me when he thought I did not perceive it, with the vain hope of detecting some traces of tears or some tokens of remorseful anguish in my face. But I managed to preserve an undisturbed though grave serenity through the day. I was not really angry. I felt for him all the time, and longed to be reconciled, but I determined he should make the first advances, or at least show some signs of a humble and contrite spirit first, for if I began, it would only minister to his self-conceit, increase his arrogance, and quite destroy the lesson I wanted to give him. He made a long stay in the dining-room after dinner, and, I fear, took an unusual quantity of wine, but not enough to loosen his tongue. For when he came in and found me quietly occupied with a book, too busy to lift my head on his entrance, he merely murmured an expression of suppressed disapprobation, and shutting the door with a bang, went and stretched himself at full length on the sofa, and composed himself to sleep. But his favourite cocker, Dash, that had been lying at my feet, took the liberty of jumping upon him and beginning to lick at his face. He struck it off with a smart blow, and the poor dog squeaked and ran cowering back to me. When he woke up about half an hour after, he called it to him again, but Dash only looked sheepish and wagged the tip of his tail. He called again more sharply, but Dash only clung the closer to me and licked my hand as if imploring protection. Enraged at this, his master snatched up a heavy book and hurled it at his head. The poor dog set up a piteous outcry and ran to the door. I let him out and then quietly took up the book. "Give that book to me," said Arthur in no very courteous tone. I gave it to him. "Why did you let the dog out?" he asked. "You knew I wanted him." "By what token?" I replied. "By your throwing the book at him. But perhaps that was intended for me." "No, but I see you've got a taste of it," said he, looking at my hand, that had also been struck and was rather severely grazed. I returned to my reading, and he endeavoured to occupy himself in the same manner, but in a little while, after several pretentious yawns, he pronounced his book to be cursed trash, and threw it onto the table. Then followed 8 or 10 minutes of silence, during the greater part of which I believe he was staring at me. At last his patience was tired out. "What is that book, Helen?" he exclaimed. I told him. "Is it interesting?" "Yes, very." "Humph!" I went on reading, or pretending to read at least. I cannot say there was much communication between my eyes and my brain, for while the former ran over the pages, the latter was earnestly wondering when Arthur would speak next, and what he would say, and what I should answer. But he did not speak again till I rose to make the tea, and then it was only to say that he should not take any. He continued lounging on the sofa and alternatively closing his eyes and looking at his watch and at me till bedtime, when I rose and took my candle and retired. "Helen!" cried he the moment I had left the room. I turned back and stood awaiting his commands. "What do you want, Arthur?" said I at length. "Nothing," replied he. "Go." I went, but hearing him mutter something as I was closing the door, I turned again. It sounded very like "confounded slut," but I was quite willing it should be something else. "Were you speaking, Arthur?" I asked. "No," was the answer, and I shut the door and departed. I saw nothing more of him till the following morning at breakfast, when he came down a full hour after the usual time. "You're very late," was my morning salutation. "You needn't have waited for me," was his, and he walked up to the window again. It was just such weather as yesterday. "Oh, this confounded rain!" he muttered. But after studiously regarding it for a minute or two, a bright idea seemed to strike him, for he suddenly exclaimed, "But I know what I'll do," and then returned and took his seat at the table. The letter bag was already there, waiting to be opened. He unlocked it and examined the contents, but said nothing about them. "Is there anything for me?" I asked. "No." He opened the newspaper and began to read. "You'd better take your coffee," suggested I. "It will be cold again." "You may go," said he, "if you've done. I don't want you." I rose and withdrew to the next room, wondering if we were to have another such miserable day as yesterday, and wishing intensely for an end to these mutually inflicted torments. Shortly after, I heard him ring the bell and give some orders about his wardrobe that sounded as if he meditated a long journey. He then sent for the coachman, and I heard something about the carriage and the horses in London and 7 o'clock tomorrow morning that startled and disturbed me not a little. "I must not let him go to London, whatever comes of it," said I to myself. "He will run into all kinds of mischief, and I shall be the cause of it. But the question is, how am I to alter his purpose? Well, I will wait a while and see if he mentions it." I waited most anxiously from hour to hour, but not a word was spoken on that or any other subject to me. He whistled and talked to his dogs, and wandered from room to room, much the same as on the previous day. At last I began to think I must introduce the subject myself, and was pondering how to bring it about, when John unwittingly came to my relief with the following message from the coachman. "Please, sir, Richard says one of the horses has got a very bad cold, and thinks, sir, that if you could make it convenient to go the day after tomorrow, instead of tomorrow, he could physic it today, so as—" "Confound his impudence!" interjected the master. "Please, sir, he says it would be a deal better if you could," persisted John, "for he hopes there will be a change in the weather shortly, and he says it's not likely when a horse is so bad with a cold, and physicked and all." "Devil take the horses!" cried the gentleman. "Well, tell him I'll think about it," he added after a moment's reflection. He cast a searching glance at me, and as the servant withdrew, expecting to see some token of deep astonishment and alarm, but being previously prepared, I preserved an aspect of stoical indifference. His countenance fell as he met my steady gaze, and he turned away in very obvious disappointment and walked up to the fireplace, where he stood in an attitude of undisguised dejection, leaning against the chimney-piece with his forehead sunk upon his arm. "Where do you want to go, Arthur?" said I. "To London," replied he gravely. "What for?" I asked. "Because I cannot be happy here." "Why not?" "Because my wife does not love me." "She would love you with all your heart if you deserved it." "What must I do to deserve it?" That seemed humble and earnest enough, and I was so much affected between sorrow and joy that I was obliged to pause a few seconds before I could steady my voice to reply. "If she gives you her heart," said I, "you must take it thankfully and use it well and not pull it to pieces and laugh in her face because she cannot snatch it away." He now turned round and stood facing me with his back to the fire. "Come then, Helen. Are you going to be a good girl?" said he. This sounded rather too arrogant, and the smile that accompanied it did not please me. I therefore hesitated to reply. Perhaps my former answer did imply too much, and he had heard my voice falter and might have seen me brush away a tear. "Are you going to forgive me, Helen?" he resumed more humbly. "Are you penitent?" I replied, stepping up to him and smiling in his face. "Heartbroken," he answered, with rueful countenance, yet with a merry smile just lurking within his eyes and about the corner of his mouth. But this could not repulse me, and I flew into his arms. He fervently embraced me, and though I shed a torrent of tears, I think I never was happier in my life than at that moment. "Then you won't go to London, Arthur?" I said, when the first transport of tears and kisses had subsided. "No, love, unless you will go with me." "I will, gladly," I answered, "if you think the change will amuse you, and if you will put off the journey till next week." He readily consented, but said there was no need of much preparation, as he should not be for staying long, for he did not wish me to be Londonized and to lose my country freshness and originality by too much intercourse with the ladies of the world. I thought this was folly, but I did not wish to contradict him now, and merely said that I was of very domestic habits, as he well knew, and had no particular wish to mingle with the world. So we are to go to London on Monday, the day after tomorrow. It is now 4 days since the termination of our quarrel, and I am sure it has done us both good. It has made me like Arthur a great deal better, and made him behave a great deal better to me. He has never once attempted to annoy me since, by the most distant allusion to Lady F., or any of those disagreeable reminiscences of his former life. I wish I could blot them from my memory, or else get him to regard such matters in the same light as I do. Well, it is something, however, to have made him see that they are not fit subjects for conjugal jest. He may see farther sometime. I will put no limits to my hopes, and in spite of my aunt's forebodings and my own unspoken fears, I trust that we shall be happy yet. Chapter 25. First Absence. On the 8th of April we went to London. On the 8th of May I returned, in obedience to Arthur's wish, very much against my own, because I left him behind. If he had come with me, I should have been very glad to get home again, for he led me such a round of restless dissipation while there, that in a short space of time I was quite tired out. He seemed bent upon displaying me to his friends and acquaintances in particular, and the public in general, on every possible occasion, to the greatest possible advantage. It was something to feel that he considered me a worthy object of pride, but I paid dearly for the gratification. For in the first place, to please him, I had to violate my cherished predilections, my almost rooted principles in favour of a plain, dark, sobered style of dress. I must sparkle in costly jewels and deck myself out like a painted butterfly, just as I had long since determined I would never do. And this was no trifling sacrifice. In the second place, I was continually straining to satisfy his sanguine expectations and do honour to his choice by my general conduct and deportment, and fearing to disappoint him by some awkward misdemeanour or some trait of inexperienced ignorance about the customs of society, especially when I acted the part of hostess, which I was not unfrequently called upon to do. And in the third place, as I intimated before, I was wearied of the throng and bustle, the restless hurry and ceaseless change of a life so alien to all my previous habits. At last he suddenly discovered that the London air did not agree with me, and I was languishing for my country home, and must immediately return to Grassdale. I laughingly assured him that the case was not so urgent as he appeared to think it, but I was quite willing to go home if he was. He replied that he should be obliged to remain a week or two longer, as he had business that required his presence. "Then I will stay with you," said I. "But I can't do with you, Helen," was his answer. "As long as you stay, I shall attend to you and neglect my business." "But I won't let you," I returned. "Now that I know you have business to attend to, I shall insist upon your attending to it, and let him be alone. And to tell the truth, I shall be glad of a little rest. I can take my rides and walks in the park as usual, and your business cannot occupy all your time. I shall see you at meal times and in the evenings at least, and that would be better than being leagues away and never seeing you at all." "But, my love, I cannot let you stay. How can I settle my affairs when I know that you're here neglected?" "I shall not feel myself neglected. While you are doing your duty, Arthur, I shall never complain of neglect. If you had told me before that you had anything to do, it would have been half done before this. And now you must make up for lost time by redoubled exertions. Tell me what it is, and I will be your taskmaster, instead of being a hindrance." "No, no," persisted the impracticable creature. "You must go home, Helen. I must have the satisfaction of knowing that you're safe and well, though far away. Don't I see that you're looking quite rakish? Your bright eyes are faded, and that tender, delicate bloom has quite deserted your cheek." "That is only with too much gaiety and fatigue." "It is not, I tell you. It's the London air. You're pining for the fresh breezes of your country home, and you shall feel them before you are 2 days older. And remember your situation, dearest Helen. On your health, you know, depends the health of the life of our future hope." "Then you really wish to get rid of me?" "Positively I do, and I will take you down myself to Grassdale and then return. I shall not be absent above a week or a fortnight at most." "But if I must go, I will go alone. If you must stay, it is needless to waste your time in the journey there and back." But he did not like the idea of sending me alone. "Why, what helpless creature do you take me for?" I replied, "that you cannot trust me to go 100 miles in our own carriage with our own footman and maid to attend me? If you come with me, I shall assuredly keep you. But tell me, Arthur, what is this tiresome business, and why did you never mention it before?" "It is only a little business with my lawyer," said he, and he told me something about a piece of property he wanted to sell in order to pay off part of the encumbrances on his estate. But either the account was a little confused, or I was rather dull of comprehension, for I could not clearly understand how that should keep him in town a fortnight after me. Still less now can I comprehend how it should keep him a month, for it's nearly that time since I left him. No signs of his return as yet. In every letter he promises to be with me in a few days, and every time deceives me, or deceives himself. His excuses are vague and insufficient. I cannot doubt that he has got among his former companions again. Oh, why did I leave him? I do intensely wish he would return. June 29th. No Arthur yet, and for many days I've been looking and longing in vain for a letter. His letters, when they come, are kind, if fair words and endearing epithets can give them a claim to the title, but very short and full of trivial excuses and promises that I cannot trust. And yet how anxiously I look forward to them. How eagerly I open and devour one of those little hastily scribbled returns for the 3 or 4 long letters hitherto unanswered that he has had from me. Oh, it is so cruel to leave me so long alone. He knows I have no one but Rachel to speak to, for we have no neighbours here except the Hargraves, whose residence I can dimly descry from these upper windows, embosomed among those low woody hills beyond the dale. I was glad when I learnt that Millicent was so near to us, and her company would be a soothing solace to me now. But she is still in town with her mother. There is no one at the Grove but little Esther and her French governess, for Walter is always away. I saw that paragon of manly perfections in London. He seemed scarcely to merit the eulogiums of his mother and sister, though he certainly appeared more conversable and agreeable than Lord Loughborough, more candid and high-minded than Mr. Grimsby, and more polished and gentlemanly than Mr. Hattersley, Arthur's only other friend whom he judged fit to introduce to me. Oh, Arthur, why won't you come? Why won't you write to me at least? You talked about my health. How can you expect me to gather bloom and vigour here, pining in solitude and restless anxiety from day to day? It would serve you right to come back and find my good looks entirely wasted away. I would beg my uncle and aunt or my brother to come and see me, but I do not like to complain of my loneliness to them, and indeed loneliness is the least of my sufferings. But what is he doing? What is it that keeps him away? It is this ever-recurring question and the horrible suggestions it raises that distract me. July 3rd. My last bitter letter has wrung from him an answer at last, and a rather longer one than usual, but still I don't know what to make of it. He playfully abuses me for the gall and vinegar of my latest effusion. He tells me I can have no conception of the multitudinous engagements that keep him away, but avers that in spite of them all he will assuredly be with me before the close of next week, though it is impossible for a man so circumstanced as he is to fix the precise day of his return. Meantime he exhorts me to the exercise of patience, that first of a woman's virtues, and desires me to remember the saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and comfort myself with the assurance that the longer he stays away, the better he shall love me when he returns. Until he does return, he begs I will continue to write to him constantly, for though he is sometimes too idle and sometimes too busy to answer my letters as they come, he likes to receive them daily. And if I fulfil my threat of punishing his seeming neglect by ceasing to write, he shall be so angry that he will do his utmost to forget me. He adds this piece of intelligence respecting poor Millicent Hargrave. Your little friend Millicent is likely before long to follow your example, and take upon her the yoke of matrimony in conjunction with a friend of mine. Hattersley, you know, has not yet fulfilled his direful threat of throwing his precious person away on the first old maid that chooses to evince a tenderness for him, but he still preserves a resolute determination to see himself a married man before the year is out. Only, he said to me, I must have someone that will let me have my own way in everything. Not like your wife, Huntington. She's a charming creature, but she looks as if she has a will of her own, and could play the vixen upon occasion. I thought you're right there, man, but I didn't say so. I must have some good quiet soul that will let me do just what I like and go where I like, keep a little home or stay away without a word of reproach or complaint, for I can't do with being bothered. Well, said I know someone that will suit you to a T if you don't care for money, and that is Hargrave's sister Millicent. He desired to be introduced to her forthwith, for he said he had plenty of the needful himself, or should have, when his old governor chose to quit the stage. So you see, Helen, I've managed pretty well for both your friend and mine. Poor Millicent. But I cannot imagine she will ever be led to accept such a suitor, one so repugnant to all her ideas of a man to be honoured and loved. 5th. Alas, I was mistaken. I have got a long letter from her this morning telling me she is already engaged and expects to be married before the close of the month. I hardly know what to say about it, she writes, or what to think. To tell you the truth, Helen, I don't like the thoughts of it at all. If I am to be Mr. Hattersley's wife, I must try to love him, and I do try with all my might, but I've made very little progress yet, and the worst symptom of the case is that the further he is from me, the better I like him. He frightens me with his abrupt manners and strange hectoring ways, and I dread the thoughts of marrying him. Then why have you accepted him, you will ask? And I didn't know I had accepted him, but Mamma tells me I have, and he seems to think so too. I certainly didn't mean to do so, but I did not like to give him a flat refusal for fear Mamma should be grieved and angry, for I knew she wished me to marry him, and I wanted to talk to her first about it, so I gave him what I thought was an evasive, half-negative answer. But she says it was as good as an acceptance, and he would think me very capricious if I were to attempt to draw back. And indeed I was so confused and frightened at the moment I can hardly tell what I said, and next time I saw him he accosted me in all confidence as his affianced bride, and immediately began to settle matters with Mamma. I had not courage to contradict them by then, and how can I do it now? I cannot. They would think me mad. Besides, Mamma is so delighted with the idea of the match, she thinks she has managed so well for me, and I cannot bear to disappoint her. I do object sometimes and tell her what I feel, but you don't know how she talks. Mr. Hattersley, you know, is the son of a rich banker, and as Esther and I have no fortunes, and Walter very little, our dear Mamma is very anxious to see us well married, that is, united to rich partners. It is not my idea of being well married, but she means it all for the best. She says when I am safe off her hands it will be such a relief to her mind, and she assures me that it will be a good thing for the family as well as for me. Even Walter is pleased at the prospect, and when I confessed my reluctance to him, he said it was all childish nonsense. Do you think it nonsense, Helen? I should not care if I could see any prospect of being able to love and admire him, but I can't. There's nothing about him to hang one's esteem and affection upon. He's so diametrically opposed to what I imagined my husband should be. Do write to me and say all you can to encourage me. Don't attempt to dissuade me, for my fate is fixed. Preparations for the important event are already going on around me. Don't say a word against Mr. Hattersley, for I want to think well of him. And though I have spoken against him for myself, it is for the last time. Hereafter I shall never permit myself to utter a word in his dispraise, however he may seem to deserve it, and whoever ventures to speak slightingly of the man I have promised to love and honour and obey must expect my serious displeasure. After all, I think he is quite as good as Mr. Huntington, if not better, and yet you love him and seem to be happy and contented, and perhaps I may manage as well. You must tell me, if you can, that Mr. Hattersley is better than he seems, that he is upright, honourable, and open-hearted, in fact a perfect diamond in the rough. He may be all this, but I don't know him. I only know the exterior, and what I trust is the worst part of him. She concludes with, Goodbye, dear Helen. I'm waiting anxiously for your advice, but mind you let it be all on the right side. Alas, poor Millicent, what encouragement can I give you, or what advice, except that it's better to make a bold stand now, though at the expense of disappointing and angering both mother and brother and lover, than to devote your whole life hereafter to misery and vain regret. Saturday, 13th. The week is over, and he is not come. All the sweet summer is passing away without one breath of pleasure to me or benefit to him, and I had all along been looking forward to this season with the fond, delusive hope that we should enjoy it so sweetly together, and that with God's help and my exertions it would be the means of elevating his mind and refining his taste to due appreciation of the salutary and pure delights of nature and peace and holy love. But now, at evening, when I see the round red sun sink quietly down behind those woody hills, leaving them sleeping in a warm red golden haze, I only think another lovely day is lost to him and me. And at morning, when roused by the flutter and chirp of the sparrows and the gleeful twitter of the swallows, all intent upon feeding their young, and full of life and joy in their own little frames, I open the window and inhale the balmy soul-reviving air, and look out upon the lovely landscape, laughing in dew and sunshine. I too often shame that glorious scene with tears of thankless misery, because he cannot feel its freshening influence. And when I wander in the ancient woods and meet the little wild flowers smiling in my path, or sit in the shadow of our noble ash trees by the waterside with their branches gently swaying in the light summer breeze that murmurs through their feathery foliage, my ears full of that low music, mingled with the dreamy hum of insects, my eyes abstractedly gazing on the glassy surface of the little lake before me, with trees that crowd about its bank, some gracefully bending to kiss its waters, some rearing their stately heads high above, but stretching down their wide arms over its margin, all faithfully mirrored far, far down in its glassy depth, though sometimes the images are partly broken by the sport of aquatic insects, and sometimes for a moment the whole is shivered into trembling fragments by a transient breeze that swept the surface too roughly. Still I've no pleasure, for the greater the happiness that nature sets before me, the more I lament that he is not here to taste it. The greater the bliss we might enjoy together, the more I feel our present wretchedness apart. Yes, ours. He must be wretched, though he may not know it. And the more my senses are pleased, the more my heart is oppressed, for he keeps it with him, confined amid the dust and smoke of London, perhaps shut up within the walls of his own abominable club. But most of all, at night, when I enter my lonely chamber and look out upon the summer moon, sweet regent of the sky, floating above me in the black blue vault of heaven, shedding a flood of silver radiance over park and wood and water, so pure and peaceful, so divine, And think, where is he now? What is he doing at this moment? Wholly unconscious of this heavenly scene, perhaps revelling with his boon companions, perhaps, God help me, it is too much. 23rd. Thank heaven he is come at last. But how altered! Flushed and feverish, listless and languid, his beauty strangely diminished, his vigour and vivacity quite departed. I have not upbraided him by word or look. I've not even asked him what he has been doing. I've not the heart to do it, for I think he is ashamed of himself. He must be so indeed, and such inquiries could not fail to be painful to both. My forbearance pleases him, touches him even, I'm inclined to think. He says he's glad to be home again, and God knows how glad I am to get him back, even as he is. He lies on the sofa nearly all day long, and I play and sing to him for hours together. I write his letters for him, and get him everything he wants, and sometimes I read to him, and sometimes I talk, and sometimes only sit by him and soothe him with silent caresses. I know he does not deserve it, for I fear I am spoiling him, but this once I will forgive him freely and entirely. I will shame him into virtue if I can, and I will never let him leave me again. He is pleased with my attentions, it may be grateful for them. He likes to have me near him, and though he is peevish and testy with his servants and his dogs, he is gentle and kind to me. What he would be, if I did not so watchfully anticipate his wants and so carefully avoid or immediately desist from doing anything he has a tendency to irritate or disturb him, with however little reason, I cannot tell. How intensely I wish he were worthy of all this care. Last night, as I sat beside him, with his head in my lap, passing my fingers through his beautiful curls, this thought made my eyes overflow with sorrowful tears, as it often does, but this time a tear fell on his face and made him look up. He smiled, but not insultingly. "Dear Helen," he said, "why do you cry? You know that I love you." And he pressed my hand to his feverish lips. "And what more could you desire?" "Only, Arthur, that you would love yourself as truly and faithfully as you were loved by me." "That would be hard indeed," he replied, tenderly squeezing my hand. I don't know whether he fully understood my meaning, but he smiled thoughtfully and even sadly, a most unusual thing with him. And then he closed his eyes and fell asleep, looking as careless and sinless as a child. As I watched that placid slumber, my heart swelled fuller than ever, and my tears flowed unrestrained. August 24th. Arthur is himself again, as lusty and reckless, as light of heart and head as ever, and as restless and hard to amuse as a spoilt child, and almost as full of mischief too, especially when wet weather keeps him within doors. I wish he had something to do, some useful trade or profession or employment, anything to occupy his head or hands for a few hours a day, and give him something besides his own pleasures to think about. If he would play the country gentleman and attend to the farm, but that he knows nothing about and won't give his mind to consider. Or if he would take up some literary study, or learn to draw or play, as he is so fond of music. I often try to persuade him to learn the piano, but he is far too idle for such an undertaking. He has no more idea of exerting himself to overcome obstacles than he has of restraining his natural appetites, and these two things are the ruin of him. I lay them both to the charge of his harsh yet careless father and his madly indulgent mother. If ever I am a mother, I will zealously strive against this crime of overindulgence. I can hardly give it a milder name when I think of the evils it brings. Happily, it will soon be the shooting season, and then, if the weather permit, he will find occupation enough in the pursuit and destruction of the partridges and pheasants. We have no grouse, or he might have been similarly occupied at this moment, instead of lying under an acacia tree pulling poor Dash's ears. But he says it's dull work shooting alone. He must have a friend or two to help him. "Let them be tolerably decent then, Arthur," said I. The word friend in his mouth makes me shudder. I know it was some of his friends that induced him to stay behind me in London and kept him away for so long. Indeed, from what he has unguardedly told me or hinted from time to time, I cannot doubt that he frequently showed them my letters to let them see how fondly his wife watched over his interests and how keenly she regretted his absence, and that they induced him to remain week after week, and plunge into all manner of excesses to avoid being laughed at for a wife-ridden fool, and perhaps to show how far he could venture to go without danger of shaking the fond creature's devoted attachment. It is a hateful idea, but I cannot believe it's a false one. Well, replied he, I thought of Lord Lowborough for one, but there's no possibility of getting him without his better half, our mutual friend Annabella, so we must ask them both. You're not afraid of her, are you, Helen? He asked with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Of course not, I answered. Why should I? And who besides? Hargrave, for one. He'll be glad to come, though his own place is so near, for he has little enough land of his own to shoot over, and we can extend our depredations into it, if we like. And he's thoroughly respectable, you know, Helen, quite a ladies' man. And I think Grimsby for another. He's a decent, quiet fellow enough. You'll not object to Grimsby? I hate him, but however, if you wish it, I'll try to endure his presence for a while. All a prejudice, Helen, a mere woman's antipathy. No, I have solid grounds for my dislike, and is that all? Why, yes, I think so. Hattersley will be too busy billing and cooing with his bride to have much time to spare for guns and dogs at present, he replied. And that reminds me that I've had several letters from Millicent since her marriage, and that she either is or pretends to be quite reconciled to her lot. She professes to have discovered numerous virtues and perfections in her husband, some of which I fear less partial eyes would fail to distinguish, though they sought them very carefully with tears. And now that she's accustomed to his loud voice and abrupt and courteous manner, she affirms she finds no difficulty in loving him, as a wife should do, and begs I will burn that letter wherein she spoke so unadvisedly against him, so that I trust she may yet be happy. But if she is, it will be entirely the reward of her own goodness of heart, for had she chosen to consider herself the victim of fate, or of her mother's worldly wisdom, she might have been thoroughly miserable, and if, for her duty's sake, she had not made every effort to love her husband, she would doubtless have hated him till the end of her days.
Poor Millicent Hargrave. I am going to continue to refer to her as Millicent Hargrave because that helped me keep track of at least that H name. Millicent Hargrave, brother Walter Hargrave, younger sister Esther Hargrave. Millicent Hargrave, good person. About to marry another one of the H names, Hattersley. Hattersley, barely not so high up on the pole of good people. And we got our rogues gallery of names here at the end of the chapter. Lord Loughborough, Annabella, who it's kind of hard to tell right now if they're married or not, but apparently if they aren't married yet, they were getting married. Hargrave, Walter Hargrave, Grimsby, the most Dickensianly named person in the book, and Hattersley. There will be the helpful chart for next week so that you can keep track of all these people. Did you catch the reference to Helen and her situation? Huntington says, and remember your situation, dearest Helen. On your health, you know, depends the health, if not the life, of our future hope. Okay, that was in her April 8th section. The next section is August, or the last section that we cross in the chapters today is August 24th. So she's somewhere around 5 months pregnant by the time these chapters are done. So that puts another interesting spin on the travel thing of him not wanting her to go by herself. Also makes it kind of weird how he wanted to go back to London by himself. I mean, it's not weird. I get it. It's not weird. But if he's that concerned, he's just leaving her with Rachel back home. Fine. But she's 5 months pregnant and he wants to bring his rogues gallery over to party. That does seem questionable. At the same time, he may have rationalized it in his own mind that this way, at least he'd be there in case she needs him, assuming she can get him sober enough to do something important should she need him to. I thought for someone who was not only never married, but never actually in a relationship with a man that we know of, I thought Anne Bronte did a pretty amazing job of the emotional pendulum swings, especially during the first year of marriage when you're kind of figuring out how to be one unit. And I hope none of you have gone through as wide a pendulum swing as our characters in our book. I certainly didn't. But on a much smaller level, it is a learning experience how to combine two lives into effectively one unit. And that can be very pendulumy. This, of course, is way worse than normal pendulum swingingness. And Huntington is a big old baby. And we see that physically in the way they are placed with his head in her lap towards the end of chapter 25. And this, of course, is the big, ugly irony that Anne Bronte is promoting, that the person with all of the legal rights, the person who is truly in charge of the relationship is an infant, and in today's chapters goes some way out of his way to infantilize his wife, the only grown-up in the room. In the hands of a lesser writer, I think this novel would have come across as far more didactic than it is. And this moment in the book is where I think even the 1996 version of Tenant of Wildfell Hall with Tara Fitzgerald, which, like I said, was fine. I think this is the point at which other readers of the book, not ours, because we are so lucky, but other professional readers of this book and people who have done stage and film versions of it start to go astray. We know Helen has a sense of humor. Not only a sense of humor, but a really good one. Because when her aunt pointed out the horror of finding your husband a worthless reprobate or even an impractical fool, Helen said, "But what are all the fools and reprobates to do? They have to marry somebody." That's funny. It's not so funny anymore, sure. But that's one of the things that makes this book so interesting and complicated, is just like in real life, the events that you live through mold you into, well, who you are right now. And some of those things are really good, and they mold you into being a good and better person. And some of those things are really challenging. And it is sometimes hard to stay a really good person when external forces are hammering at you. And especially like in Huckleberry Finn, especially if the external forces are telling you that you are wrong for doing something that you know to be moral. You get a 1984 moment. You get the 2 + 2 = 5. Because what are you supposed to do in Helen's and Millicent's case? The law and society are telling you that your husband is right, just by virtue of the fact that he's your husband and a guy. And yet, it sets you up for something that I think I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, that if the guy is cheating on you and you say something about that, and he turns on you and says, "Why are you so paranoid?" Well, it's true. You may be paranoid, but that also doesn't mean that you're not right. There's going to be a lot more of that going on. And by the way, caveat here, I know that plenty of abuse can be done by women to their partner as well. It is not just a one-way street. The reason that we're focusing so much on the guy being the perpetrator here is because in Anne Bronte's world, the guys had all the legal firepower between them. So anything these days, in our modern times, anything that Huntington does, well, not anything, a lot of what Huntington does, I have seen women do to guys and other women. So yeah, it is not a one-way street, and I want to make sure that I make it clear that I'm aware of that. It's that we're in a very confined and constrained world in this book, and Anne Bronte clearly had a point to make. So we are going to see Helen, and I'm warning you because I want you to be prepared for this. The further along she goes in this relationship the more of a corner she is going to be backed into. And because of that, we will watch her personality change. This is what I had started to say about where I think the TV shows and the movies and sometimes the readers get it wrong. As she changes, she has to be the counterbalance to the reprobate behavior that surrounds her. That will make her professionally unpleasant. We have to keep remembering how funny she was, how light she was, how much of a twinkle there was in her eye in the beginning when we first met her in her diary. And we've got to hold on to that the same way that she needs to hold on to that. Because life is hard for her right now, and it's going to get harder. And yeah, maybe the timing of doing this book wasn't so great because life is hard for all of us right now. Oy. Oh, which reminds me, I haven't told you. I got a job as not a contact tracer for the state of Pennsylvania, but as one of the 5 trainers for the contact tracers in the state of Pennsylvania. Last week when I was recording, I hadn't had the final interview yet. I had the final interview after I recorded, and I got the job Friday night. So I start next week. I have no idea how that is going to affect my life. So the schedule might be a little wonky next week, but there will be an episode one way or another. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it. I am going to let Janalee play us out this week. She called in and she left a voicemail about Room with a View, which is one of the books that is available as a premium book on the app. So if you download the app and you put it on your tablet or your phone and you go to craftlit.libsyn.com/premium, sign up there. You have to do it on a browser for complicated Apple app reasons. You will have access to all of the premium books. Jennifer has been very good for all of you as well, because every time there's been a chapter or a section of a book that for whatever reason didn't publish properly, she's been pinging me so that I was able to re-release those premium episodes so that they would be available to you. Because the older ones I had started to move off of the feed. It just seemed crazy to have books from 2011 on the feed. So yes, premium books available on the app. Let's see, the app is on iOS, Android, and Windows phones. So available wherever you live on your device. And Janalee's comments are about the book A Room with a View, which is a lovely counterpoint to Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I have to say. It hadn't occurred to me until I was listening to Janalee's comments, and I think you will agree, after listening, that it was quite a solid book choice on her part. All right, I will let Janalee take us out, and I will talk to you next week. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of each other, wear a mask, lower that viral load. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Hi, Heather. This is Janalee, Knits and Hikes on Ravelry, and I just finished the last 2 chapters of Room with a View and listened to your commentary. And I have to agree with you. This is a very big book in a very small wrapper. A lot of the things that he talks about in this book, that he stresses the importance of loving people. He stresses the importance of kindness, regardless of what country you're from or what class you belong to. I really appreciate and admire his ability to make that so clear in his writing without making the people who are reading it feel like they're guilty or bad, if that makes sense. So many times when you have people writing about things that are important to them, they make their points in a way that makes the reader feel guilty if they don't agree with if they don't agree with the author or with all the author's points, or if they feel like they have been doing the things that the author is judging as bad behavior. So I appreciate that Ian Forster was able to paint this beautiful picture of love and of acceptance without acting like the grandmother that's got her finger out and is shaking you, you naughty boy, how dare you. So I like that part of it. I had some thoughts on, I made notes. So I had a lot of thoughts about what you said at the end. And I wanted to go through, so Mr. Beebe, I want to start with Mr. Beebe. He's angry with Lucy, but he may also be angry with George. I don't know because I can't remember seeing or hearing anything specific about this, but he may have been attracted to George and be angry because while George is continuing to, long after Lucy, and Mr. Beebe is perfectly fine with that longing being unrequited, when Lucy returns the love and is willing to accept, George and live together with him or admit that she loves him, then George is no longer lonely and like a martyr, but also Lucy is no longer lonely and like a martyr. Mr. Beebe, it seems, has decided that in order to fit in with society, he has to deny himself certain things that he would be maybe wanting in his life otherwise. And like I said, or like you said earlier, we don't know for sure because the enforcer never says, oh, Mr. Beebe is like me. He's attracted to men instead of women, which is completely unacceptable in his society at the time. But I think he is a little bit angry because Lucy doesn't choose celibacy or an unmarried state over a happy partnership, because what she's doing is saying that love is more important than what society thinks of me. And Mr. Beebe is saying, in his own mind, perhaps, that what society thinks of me is more important than love. So he might be angry about that, that he thinks that she's settling for something instead of, being one of those martyred saints that gives up something so important for something better, like society's approval. I'm not really sure. But that occurred to me, that his anger might be at both of them, at Lucy and at George, not just at Lucy. I had a thought about Charlotte. I can totally see George's bright side of things, where he's like, Charlotte just, she wanted to do what was right and what society had taught her to do, and what she had done in her own life, perhaps, in rejecting the love that she had been offered. But the more she was around Lucy and the more she thought about what she had seen between Lucy and George, the more she felt like that was what needed to happen instead of what society would approve of happening. And I can totally see that. But I do want to point out that Charlotte may also thought that she was ruining Lucy by encouraging this romance with George as a punishment, since Lucy couldn't let go of him. That okay, fine, you've made your bed, you have to live with it. Now no one will talk to you anymore because you're living with or loving or being married to this person who is so far out of your societal class. So maybe it's entirely possible for Lucy to have not gotten the consent of her mother, and so she's cut off from society because she married without her mother's permission, because her mother would want a society marriage over a marriage that forced her daughter to live in a class that was below what she was accustomed to having. So it's entirely possible that since George is her love but not her social equal, her mother was against the marriage and wouldn't talk to her or cast her out. And I could see that happening as well. But you're right, if they didn't marry and they were just living together, that would be like, you would probably have to go to a different country. I believe that happened with a couple of fairly famous people where their marriages weren't, or their love wasn't acceptable in England, and so they went to France or they went to Italy or wherever, that they could go and they could live somewhere and be apart from society and be apart from their families, but still be together with the person that they loved. Okay, two last things. I did want to say that George, while he may be right about Charlotte, also doesn't remember which room was his at the Italian villa. And it says in the book right there that he disliked any darkness. So he may be deliberately looking for a bright side to Charlotte. which is totally fine because they probably won't be talking to Charlotte anytime soon, and it's probably easier on them if they can attribute her actions to a positive as opposed to a negative. And yes, I love this book so much. So thank you so much for putting it in there. Thank you. So anyway, thank you for the time, and I'll talk to you later.
If you like what you heard today, please leave a review over at iTunes. Join us on Facebook. Meet up with the knitters on Craftlet's Corner of Ravelry. Stay in the know on Instagram, or add your name to our mailing list, which I promise will never spam you. In fact, you probably want to buy a lottery ticket on any day that you get a message from the Craftlet mailing list, because that'll be a special day. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.